Welcome to the show, Paul Barlow, otherwise known as Paul the Other One on many social media platforms. Paul, kia ora, and good evening to our Anzac Day show.
Kia ora, Pat. Great to be here.
It's not what we've talked about or why we've talked about it, but what's Anzac Day all about for you, if anything?
For me, I grew up in a family where most of the people served in the Navy. So it's a lot about Navy service and what was sort of sacrificed. All three of my uncles on mum's side were in the Navy. My grandmother on mum's side was a Navy nurse. One of my uncles was one of the unfortunate souls who got sent out to the atomic testing sites and ended up passing away from cancer about 10 years ago. So it's always been very important to us to make sure that we commemorate the day to remember the service and the sacrifice that they went through.
With the family lineage of armed services, was it ever something that you considered?
No, it wasn't for me because I think, well, particularly with my grandmother, she was very much, if you don't have a job, you're going into the military service for her kids.
Right.
And that was something that kind of got passed down. And I've always been working. Military service has just never been something that I've done. But my kids, my oldest son actually went through like Air Force Training Corps, the kids one that they do, the cadets. He was always very keen on that kind of stuff as well.
Very cool. All right. Well, listen, I saw you posting all over the interweb today about the Waitangi Tribunal and Karen Chhour.
Yeah.
Chhour. So I thought maybe I should have a chat with you. What I'd like to be able to do is break it down into the three parts. You know, what is a Waitangi Tribunal?
Mm-hmm.
What were they expecting of the minister, and what has happened? I think there are three things to look at. And you, of course, sort of broke this on our show last night because you put a comment up there. I'd seen it pop up on my phone as well, but you put a comment up there pretty quick after that, and got it that she doesn't have to appear before the Waitangi Tribunal. So can we start at the very beginning, as Julie Andrews once said? It's a very good place to start.
Yeah.
If you were spelling it out to a 5-year-old, to someone who didn't really understand the Waitangi Tribunal, how would you describe it?
I'd probably go, all right, David, this is how it works. The Waitangi Tribunal was set up in the mid-70s to ensure that there was an outside judicial body that kept the Crown to account to meet its obligations under Te Tiriti or Waitangi. And that's pretty much it. Most people think of it in terms of settlements because that's the big work that they've done. But the whole point has been to make sure that the Crown meets its obligations, because when it comes to that particular document, the Crown is the one who's failed everybody. They're the ones who haven't met their obligations under it. So it was set up basically to keep people on task and make sure that the government and the Crown was staying on task when it came to dealing with Te Tiriti and getting the outcomes that were promised under that document.
So when you say judicial body, many people will think judge. When they think judge, they'll think court.
Yeah.
But we are being told this week by David Seymour and the likes that this isn't a court and they've got no power over us.
Yeah, it's a tribunal in the same way that there's a disputes tribunal. It's still part of the judicial system, but it's not the same as going to court. It's a sort of standalone process to it.
Okay. What was the tribunal expecting of Karen Chhour?
They wanted answers. They've got questions. Section 7AA of the Act is really specific. It was put in place in 2019 to deal specifically with rangatahi youth. So it's all about making sure you get the best outcomes for Māori youth that find themselves in that particular system. And the results have been really positive. There's been huge amounts of change in that timeframe because the CEO has to report every year on what they're doing, who they're interacting with, and what the outcomes are. And we're seeing much more equitable outcomes between Māori and non-Māori youth who find themselves in that Oranga Tamariki system. So what they want to know is why she wants to get rid of it. What is the evidence that this is something that needs to be got rid of? What her own personal experiences are, because that's how she's selling this. She was somebody who was lifted up when she was younger and put into foster care. And she felt that because of her Māori background, that it was a little bit harder for them to find the right place, and she didn't feel that she fit in because she'd grown up in Australia and the North Shore. And so they need to get those kind of context clues to work out whether or not the decision to remove this is something that has evidence behind it before they can turn around and say, well, look, it's clearly not something that's designed to harm Māori or put Māori back, or it doesn't meet obligations under Te Tiriti. And they want to know what's going on, but she hasn't answered.
The way I read or understand 7AA, is the CEO needs to report back on the obligations to the treaty that there is and the outcomes, the integrating of the treaty into the ministry has impacted children. And if that's accurate, then what I hear ACT saying is we do not want to have any reports coming back to us talking about how the treaty interacts with this legislation. And when you say it like that, you're like, no, that kind of makes sense for ACT. What have I missed there, or is that pretty accurate?
That's pretty accurate. That's a big part of it. The actual input in the Act is really detailed on that. They have to take, Oranga Tamariki has to take into consideration things like hapu and iwi affiliations, what the child actually wants, because they might be somebody who doesn't feel like they have a connection already with Te Ao Māori. So putting them into an environment where that is the case shouldn't be the highest priority.
Right.
But the reporting itself also includes what they've done, but also what the outcomes have been, some of the organisations that they've worked with. And it says in the Act itself, if a Māori-led organisation goes to Oranga Tamariki and says, we want to work with you and this is how we plan to do it and how we're going to help, the CEO has to meet with them and he has to sit down and discuss how they could work together. There is nothing stopping something like Man Up, for example, going to Oranga Tamariki and saying, let's have that conversation. I don't know that they ever have, to be honest, but it is, there's nothing stopping them because they would technically fall into the definition of a Māori-led organisation that deals with those sort of issues. The reports themselves are really fascinating and they're publicly available. So people can jump online and see them, and they track all sorts of information like the number of kids that have been put into the system or had reports against them, or that have been uplifted and been rehomed or found new places to care. And in every single report that they've done since 2020, it's tracked downwards for rangatahi youth. So that the evidence is printed and published every year that this is working in the long run. And there'll always be exceptions. There'll always be the odd story that you hear about something not quite working right.
Yeah.
But overall, the results have been really positive.
It's interesting as well, because you use the word outcomes in that part of the answer to the question. And it seems that it's getting very positive outcomes. And we've heard our hairless leader talk for 18 months about how important outcomes were. And it just brings me back to that situation and that ponderance that this national-led government doesn't want research unless it suits their narrative. Doesn't want experience unless it suits their narrative.
Yes.
And does want outcomes unless it doesn't suit their narrative. Then all of a sudden they don't want them.
Yeah, well, Karen's the perfect example of that as well, because as she says, she was uplifted, she was put into foster care when she was younger, but Karen was not, in that age group in 2019 to 2020 when this law came into place. She is not that young. So the law that was guiding what happened to her then is completely different to the law that's in place now. And her experiences, while they've shaped her views, they're not necessarily relevant on what's actually happening with this particular piece of legislation.
So what we've got is a tribunal, otherwise known as the Waitangi Tribunal, part of the judiciary, basically going, yo, what's up? Can you explain this to us? And she's gone, no. She has actually pulled a Karen, pardon the pun, and said, I want to speak to your manager, being David Seymour. And so now that she's said no, and then now that the High Court has ruled she doesn't have to, where does that leave us? Or have I gone one step too far? Should we talk about what the High Court has actually said first and then go to where does that leave us?
Well, essentially the High Court has said that they can't see an actual path that legally forces an MP to be summoned in front of the tribunal, because it's not really ever happened before. This is the first time the tribunal's ever requested
because
that.
MPs would come. MPs would come and offer and answer questions.
Yeah, if they don't show up, they'll send something written, and Karen hasn't even done that. There's been no communication. And the tribunal is working on a bit of a time frame. We saw with Te Whaka Aiora, I think it was, the Māori Health Authority, the government sitting there going, oh, no, we're not going to rush this through to wind it up, and then putting it in before the tribunal had a chance to have a discussion about it. And the tribunal can't touch any piece of legislation that's going through the parliamentary process. So that's one of the reasons why they want to get these answers sorted now before this introduction is put into parliament and the process starts. But the finding was essentially, it's never happened before. There's nothing actually saying it has to happen if the tribunal summons an MP. So we have to say she's not bound by it.
Yeah.
But my favorite part of the feedback that they gave was this is her fault. She was the one who has put this bill forward, that's talked about it, that's promoted it, that's put it on her own experience, and she is the one who's refused to answer questions. This is her fault, and she needs to wear that.
And the other thing now, obviously, is where to from here. Does this, on some level, maybe there'd be some ministers or MPs in the past that would have participated, now kind of go, well, fuck that. If Karen can say no, then we're going to say no too. Is this quite a bad result for the effectiveness of the Waitangi Tribunal?
I think so. I think the groundwork was kind of laid last week when you had Shane Jones and David Seymour sitting there criticising the role of the tribunal already. And the first thing David did yesterday when the result came out was a celebratory tweet with, was it something like finally or at last, or something humble and respectful.
As you'd expect.
Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, they've been laying the groundwork for this for a little while with those particular parties, and now they've got a precedent to say, well, we don't have to show, we don't have to answer. But there is also a legal avenue that the people that brought the case before the court can go through, and they can raise it up to appeals or to the Supreme Court. But the meeting's tomorrow. So it's a really tough one to know if they're actually going to go ahead with it.
Yeah. It seems to me that the tribunal was playing an essential part in our judicial process, in our legislative process.
Yes.
And once again, if they're not able to summon people legally, what they are is something that's been advising and questioning and helping understand the situations now. And this has just given a big old green light to a bunch of people who currently sit on the right, who say things like, we should all be equal under one race. Who are now just going to basically nutsack this thing, and to them now this is an irrelevant tribunal for the rest of our term. That's how it feels. That's the damage it feels like it's done.
Oh yeah, it has huge ramifications, and this is a government that's not so keen on dealing with issues long term. They want to rush things through. They've got the fast track process, but responsibility is not something that they're so keen on having when they sign up to all of these fast track processes. So they're quite happy, I think, to take this out of the box. The original 1989 Act, I don't believe had any link at all, any mention of the Treaty of Waitangi.
Right, wow.
Because it was done in the late 80s. It wasn't something that was common to go into most laws. It was a recognition that it's there as part of the founding documents. But if I remember correctly, that's one act that possibly didn't even have that in there.
Yeah, so it's just added another layer of scariness to perhaps the next 2 to 2.5 years that we might be facing legislatively with this government. Hey, look, before we let you go, and thanks for jumping in here on an Anzac Day for a quick chat. You're a man of the media. We did a big show last night on Melissa Lee and what's happening there. Do you got any thoughts around that? Do you want to share with the punters a bit about that? Sitting you here.
So I had the pleasure of having some very brief interactions with Melissa Lee last weekend, actually,
Right.
and it at an event called Culture Fest here in Tamariki, Makaurau. As one of the local MPs, she was there. She enjoyed the free food. She enjoyed not talking to people. It was really fascinating. I think the actual problem with her and with Penny Simmons for Mr. CEO Luxon is he gets really confused between confidence and competence. Yeah. And he thinks that somebody who's confident, like Penny Simmons was, is competent, but somebody who is confident and like Melissa Lee should be confident, 6 years in the role as spokesperson. She's been an MP for ages. She worked in the industry, but she was nervous when she was dealing with the press, and that comes through as not particularly confident. So he's equated that with competence. So I suspect that it's, he's getting his, what was it, aces in their spaces.
Oh God.
I know. Yes. Every time I hear him talk, I just have this picture of the boss from Office Space with his coffee cup and his, I'm going to need you to come in on Saturday. Yeah, it's that. Yeah,
that one you mean.
Yeah, exactly. I bet you that red stapler is sitting somewhere on the 9th floor at the moment.
Yeah, funny you would say that because Alf Surprise Reshuffle sent me back that one. That's exactly what you're saying. Yeah, I'm going to need you to get your aces in their places. That'd be great.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is such a corporate word salad. But
Yeah.
I suspect because he is a CEO, and everybody who's worked anywhere near some kind of corporate organization, you'll know there's a difference between competence and confidence.
Yeah.
And CEOs are really good at getting it mixed up.
I wonder if CEOs never have to deal with that side of things because they only speak to the top level managers who you would expect to be
Yeah.
competent and confident
Yes.
because they've gone through the system to become a, very
Top
well
level
paid,
manager.
high level manager. And I wonder if that's the difference. I mean, you could be an MP, you could be a minister with no experience in that area. I mean, given a portfolio, because you kind of have got a bit of a passion for that. And that reeks of perhaps on some level, the quality of people who we've got running our country.
I mean, Penny Simmons was always an interesting choice for the disability portfolio because she has a disabled child. So for her, it's personal experience, and that's not a bad thing to bring to the table.
For sure.
But as somebody who has a child with special needs, surely she would know that, immediately cutting off funding now to everything to help people who care with it, that's just not going to fly. But also the fact that she didn't report back in December issues that they thought they'd found. And those issues are only there because the government needs to make all these cuts to pay their tax cuts. And that's the thing that there's so much going on. People forget to add that into any of the conversations.
We don't forget.
I know you guys don't forget. You guys are brilliant at it. But yeah, anything they do, everything they cut. The story yesterday that they were looking at cutting $6 billion worth of cyclone relief funding. That's ridiculous.
It also makes me think of Luxon's leadership. And I saw someone, it might have been on my Twitter feed, it might have been in someone else's, talking about actually what a competent leader would do is bring in the underperforming manager, would give them a chance to upskill, would give them, in fact, I was thinking about this, legally, you can't just fire someone.
No.
You can't just go, there's a process to go through. And I did wonder, I mean, she hasn't been fired as an MP, but she'll have obviously lost a pretty big chunk of a salary moving off ministerial cabinet. Not at all?
No, because both of those MPs still have other outside of cabinet portfolios.
Okay.
Their salary still sits at around $249,000 a year.
Okay. But even so, a competent leader would work with his managers to get them up to speed first. And that didn't happen. Yeah. The other thing is I believe he's what he's trying to sell himself as a decisive, what did he say? This is how I roll
this is how
leader.
Jumping into action a month after it happens.
When I see him get rid of a New Zealand First or an ACT minister, that's when I will think he's a straight shooter, guy who's going to just go for it if he needs to. That's when I'll believe him.
I mean, you look at somebody like Casey Costello and what she did. She lied to cabinet when she was putting together her proposals around smoking and repealing the tobacco laws. Yeah. That's against the rules, that's against the cabinet manual to deliberately mislead the cabinet like that. But she's still sitting there because she's in Winston's party, and you can't go and upset the apple cart because suddenly he's not a leader of anything.
He's kind of more like a withered apple cart, like an apple that's been fallen off the tree and it's been sitting on the ground for a week or two, like a rotting apple cart. That might be a more accurate way to think about old Winston, Paul.
Oh yeah, very, very rotten.
Hey, it's lovely to have you on. I genuinely thanks so much for jumping in.
My pleasure.
Just last minute, we thought, let's do this. And you said, yep. And here we are for the lovely punters on their Anzac night pre-recorded show. So is there anything else you want to tell people about where to find you, how to get you, anything that's going on at the moment?
You can track me down everywhere. I'm just busy doing a billion things all at once. So it's as always. But yeah, find me, Google me. It's easy enough.
Paul, the other one. Hey, dude, thanks for jumping in. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Pat.
Kia ora again, whānau. The clip you've just watched is brought to you today by our patrons. If you want to be a part of what we do, if you want to get behind what we're doing, if you're enjoying our content and wanting to share our content, then maybe you would consider being a patron to Big Hairy News. Head to www.patreon.com/Big Hairy News to sign up to one of our levels and be a patron. At this point, we are only a listener and viewer supported show. It all comes down to you guys. If you feel like jumping on board to help, then head to patreon.com/Big Hairy News. Hooroo.